It's the week ending Saturday the 19th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen President Putin claiming to be withdrawing troops from Ukraine's border, Prince Andrew agreeing to pay more than £12 million in an out-of-court settlement to Virginia Giuffre, and teenage Russian figure skater Kamila Valiyev cleared to continue competing at the Winter Olympics despite having failed a drug test. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith. From the Week magazine, we have assistant editor Leif Arbuthnot, and my favourite freelancer with an 8-syllable name, it's Suchandrika Chakrabarti. OK, Holden, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why Canada's government won't keep on trucking.
The government is issuing an order with immediate effect under the Emergencies Act, authorizing Canadian financial institutions to temporarily cease providing financial services where the institution suspects that an account is being used to further the illegal blockades and occupations.
Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, invoking the Emergency Act to combat the long-running trucker protest in Ottawa on Monday. So, Holden, before we get on to the Emergency Act concerned, just remind us what's been going on in Ottawa.
Yeah, for about 3 weeks now, there's been a group of demonstrators gathered in a part of central Ottawa and blockading streets and at one point a bridge. This was originally in protest at compulsory COVID tests for truck drivers coming into Canada from the US. But it has really broadened and attracted a whole range of groups. Most of them are opposed to some form of COVID regulations, but also some who just don't like Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government, and even some who've been attracted by a general sort of vaguely Trumpian sentiment.
Yes, because originally, as you say, they were protesting specifically about forced vaccinations, which, you know, the public, I think, had some sympathy for. It's a similar debate here, isn't it, with working in the NHS? But this has got much wider, hasn't it? And not just in Canada, but in other countries around the world as well. Yeah,
it's a real ragtag of causes and movements. In some ways quite similar to the anti-lockdown protests that we saw in the UK last year. They were pretty small groups, but they really encompassed everything from a sort of free Julian Assange move to anti-5G. In the Canadian case, particularly, they seem to have been latched onto by Fox News, and Donald Trump has been talking in support of them, and so a lot of the sort of broad right-wing populist type movements have been supporting them both vocally on social media but also financially with donations.
And now, to combat that this week, Suchandrika, Canada's government has been using the Emergency Act. What is that, and what does it give the government power to do?
So they've invoked the Act and some of the powers they now have as a government. They have extraordinary powers for 30 days, including the power to prohibit public assembly. That seems like a really big one. To prevent certain types of travel and to prevent the use of certain property. So the move comes, amid all this disruption. I've been following this live blog, The Independent, and there's just like stuff happening all the time. But I think the travel one is very interesting because it bars like specific movement from specific areas. So from Parliament Hill or major border crossings, because obviously we were talking about truckers and the ability to be quite mobile if they wanted to be. They can order the evacuation of people and personal property from certain areas and possibly use this to clear out congested areas of protesters in public. And they can direct individuals and companies to render essential services. So maybe getting tow trucks in, maybe looking at other clearing services and kind of physically removing protesters and the things they put in place during their protest.
Which is quite a big move, Leif, isn't it? Because, as Suchandrika says, this act was created in the 1980s, but it did have a predecessor, which was called something like the War Act, which was only used in the First and Second World War in Canada and once afterwards by Justin Trudeau's dad, actually. Do you think this event passes the test? They're not supposed to be able to invoke this legislation unless the emergency cannot be addressed by any existing federal law. I mean, it's just a protest.
It is just a protest, but I think it's starting to really snarl up parts of the kind of Canada and American economy. So I think that people are getting slightly tiring of it, ordinary Canadians, and also obviously all the people who are in Ottawa who can't go about their daily lives. But yeah, I mean, it's totally up for debate whether, and I'm sure that probably it'll be settled in a sort of very legalistic way, whether the protests amount to something serious enough to invoke this like pretty heavy duty act. Justin Trudeau, to his credit, has been really reluctant to, well, maybe not to his credit, because it's perhaps the bare minimum you should expect, but he has been very reluctant to kind of bring in the military to clear these protests. And lots of angry people in Canada, and especially in America, have been saying, come on, bring in the army. And he's been saying, no, not yet. Or in fact, probably not at all.
Holden, how have the people of Canada, specifically those who support the protesters, responded to its use?
There has been quite a lot of consternation from both people who do support the protest, and roughly a third of Canadians seem to have some sympathy with the protesters, or at least some of them, and also actually some on the Liberal side who may disagree with a lot of what the protesters are saying, but are also slightly alarmed by the potential for infringement of civil liberties that this emergency act entails.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that then, because we're talking about it like it's just a sort of political thing. It's not, is it? I mean, as we heard in the clip there, this means if you're involved in the protest, the government have said banks can freeze your accounts. You know, there's an element of, if this was to catch on around the world, a sort of social credit type system here, isn't there? Where people say, oh, if you're involved in too much anger against the government, we will take away your rights.
Yes, and this is, as we heard in the clip, this isn't a potential threat. This is actually happening. The Canadian government has asked banks to review any relationship they have with people involved in the protest, to freeze their assets, close their accounts, and to pass all of that information about their clients to the police. And they can do that with immunity from any civil action they might ordinarily face for taking that kind of sweeping act. And there's no judicial review, there's no court orders involved. So that is something that I think a lot of protesters from any political perspective would be quite anxious about seeing rolled out more generally, because these are the sorts of things that can have not only direct consequences for individuals who can't access their bank accounts, but also quite long-term effects for people who find themselves in a sort of banking limbo where they can no longer get services. They possibly can't get a job anymore, or they can't pay their bills because they just don't have access to banking services.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination, Suchandrika, does it, to think, well, if those sorts of legislative checks aren't in place, people will slip through, either people who were suspected and weren't there and weren't anything to do with it and then have all kinds of problems administratively, or the knock-on effect on people's families will happen. You know, a man has his bank account frozen, but that has knock-on effects for his wife and children.
And at what point do you sort of drop the charges against someone in this sort of situation where you're not actually taking them to trial necessarily? I don't think that's been spoken about. So at what point does someone prove themselves that they're not going to protest about this anymore? They should have their bank account reinstated. And I think beyond even just that problem, the fact that social media means that people can regroup, these protests can go international. It feels like these are quite blunt instruments the government is using, quite an old instrument against quite a new problem where people can assemble, find each other online, find other places to assemble. And it seems to set quite a worrying precedent for other international protests as well. If we look at our country, you know, the policing bill is sort of still just about alive, and it's like going for another reading, and it's the protest part of it that's still going. And, you know, we've had protests against the chilling effect against protests. So to take away someone's right to protest does seem like a very big and scary move. And at what point can someone prove they're not going to protest about this issue anymore? I'm not sure we can prove that.
And I think one of the worrying things about outsourcing those sorts of decisions to banks rather than to police and courts is that there's much less transparency there, and it's not really in the bank's financial interests to weigh up very carefully all of the cases that might come before it and investigate those grey areas where somebody's somewhere in between a core protester who's sort of disrupting what's going on and somebody who's just turned up because they feel some sort of general kinship, and instead, they're the simpler solution for them, the solution that exposes them to less legal risk in those cases, is just to close everything and ask questions later, or if at all.
And also the issue here, Leif, is that there is a right to protest. These people do have the right to make their voices heard and to have an opinion on an issue. The thing that the Canadian government understandably is objecting to is its impact on their macroeconomy. They've shut down a bridge, they've stopped supply chains, they've affected people's jobs. The government can't responsibly let that go on for too long. But that's a distinction that is quite hard to sort of separate, isn't it? Are you still affecting the economy by supporting a protest or not?
Yeah, and I'm sort of encouraged that this is something that is really worrying people, because I think in a sort of thriving democracy, there's always a kind of push and pull between kind of the principles of freedom and also the right for the majority to go about their lives without kind of major problems. But one of the things that's kind of interested me about this protest is that all of the truckers basically come with their own barricades. That these enormous vans are essentially like sort of French Revolutionary, those kind of little walls that they used to set up in Paris. And so I think it's we've seen these protests kind of catch on and move across the kind of the world, and maybe that will continue. And that's partly because of the kind of efficiency of these protests, given the actual instruments that the protesters are using.
Yeah, and as this spreads around the world, Holden, you're talking about different groups of people with different relationships with the police. David Frum's piece in The Atlantic this week mentioned how Canadians are kind of implicitly law-abiding. Even the protesting truckers stopped honking their horns when that became illegal. But Trump-supporting Americans is a very different constituency.
Yeah, that's true. And the Trump-supporting Americans have proved themselves willing to use violence in their cause. On January the 6th last year, there had been concerns that a truckers' convoy, sort of inspired by the Canadian protest, might attempt something to disrupt the Super Bowl. That clearly didn't happen, but there are still fears that there might be similar protests there. The other thing that David Frum article in The Atlantic pointed out, which is sort of almost running counter to that, is actually that there's also a sort of internationalization of these sorts of protests, where people are kind of borrowing symbols and traditions from each other in ways that don't really seem to apply to the local context. So there were several US Confederate flags spotted at the Canadian protest, which really seems to have very little relationship to COVID regulations in Canada, and suggest that there is this sort of broader populist, maybe anti-liberal bent to the protest, particularly because Justin Trudeau and his government are sort of so closely associated with that tradition in politics and its opposition to the more Trumpian approach.
It's difficult, isn't it, Suchandrika? Because it's similar with the Black Lives Matter protests from 2020, isn't it? In that when that started being echoed, I think, around Europe, people in Europe were saying, OK, we know we have a problem with discrimination within the police and towards people of colour, but it's not the same as America, where people are effectively being shot dead because they're black. But then as it played out, actually the use of all the symbolism from Black Lives Matter in America actually did have resonance for people in other countries. And they were saying, well, the situation may not be directly analogous, but it's worth talking about. This is a way for us to simplify the story so that you talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the essential question is, what do the truckers stand for in Canada? And there is similar protests and similar movements across the world, but it tends to be, like, as Holden has mentioned, a general move against liberal governments, a general populist. We kind of don't like what's going on. We want it to be different, but what do they stand for? Like, even with January the 6th, we don't actually know for definite what they stood for, because they had Trump in office, and yes, he was leaving. Was it just about that, or was it about what they thought very much heavy, quote unquote, it was a stolen election? Those were very American issues. So what is it that other countries are picking up on? Is it just a political position, or is it something bigger? Are these kind of groups that are growing online that we're not seeing and we're not hearing about, and we don't actually know what they want yet, but we're going to find out? It's a tough one.
Yeah, or just a recognition, I suppose, around the world that other people are angry about stuff, and there's solidarity with them.
There is also a group within the protests in Canada who I think, sincerely believe themselves to be advancing a liberal cause and saying that they are standing up for freedom of choice and whether they should be required to be vaccinated or not, and saying they're more than happy for other people to be vaccinated, but they just don't think they should be forced to by the state. And you know that's complicated by the sort of fellow travellers of that movement. But I think that that is a point that's worth disentangling from all of that, because it's not entirely without merit.
Yeah, I mean, on that particular issue, the issue itself, Leif, we had Djokovic this week, didn't we, talking to the BBC, saying he would rather miss future tournaments in tennis than be forced to take a vaccine. Do you think the public eventually will accept vaccination as a job requirement, or is the jury still out on that?
I think the jury is still out on that. And I think to some extent, especially in the UK, the public has already accepted vaccination as a kind of entry requirement for certain professions. We know that in the NHS, for instance, mandatory vaccination has been the case for a very long time, not against COVID-19, obviously, because that only emerged 2 years ago. But I don't think this is a settled matter. That I think that if you kind of ask people in different countries and in different places, even different areas of the UK, whether they think that tennis players should be vaccinated to even play in a tournament, they would, you'd find different opinions. Although my instincts are that in the UK, we like to kind of talk a big talk about freedom of choice, about what you do with your body, but that people are also they've got a very strong instinct against elites feeling that they can do what they want. So lots of people with this Novak Djokovic affair seem to be pretty happy to see him, boshed on the head by the Australian kind of government and the instruments of the state generally. And I think people sometimes get these things confused, where they like to see everyone forced to behave like they are, even if they're really famous and really talented, like Novak Djokovic. And yet they kind of sometimes lose sight of what those rules can actually mean longer term for the country, and also just generally for the sort of direction that a society is going in.
I suppose it's worth just underlining, Holden, on this, because it did get a lot of news attention, that the truckers in Canada don't even represent the majority of Canadian truckers.
No, 90% of Canadian truck drivers have been vaccinated. Canada as a whole has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. And yeah, there clearly are a lot of people who drive trucks who just have accepted that this is a sensible rule during a time of pandemic. And it seems that the protesters really are in a minority.
Okay, we're going to keep on trucking with Leif up next after this. Okay, Leif, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should water company executives have their pay linked to pollution?
So I'm standing here on the banks of the River Wye, which should be the jewel in the crown of Hereford City. I'm just on the outskirts of the city here. This should be a crystal clear water. You should be able to see fish rising. You should see kingfishers flying by. You should be able to look into the water and see all the little fishes and mayflies and things. And what I'm seeing here is green, slimy water.
Helen Stace, Chief Executive Officer at Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, speaking back in September. Bonus points if you recognised any of the birds in the background. Leif, what's the story?
So David Black, who is the sort of interim chief executive of Ofwat, which is the water regulator, has been saying that perhaps water company chief executives should have their pay linked to the levels of pollution that are picked up in water. It's linked more broadly, this interview, to a growing issue we've had in the UK with our very dirty rivers. I think there were about 400,000 sewage spills into rivers in the UK last year.
400,000 in a year?
Yeah. I mean, they're constantly...
That sounds like a decade's amount.
I know, it's an extraordinary amount. And the idea is that these water companies are only meant to sort of pump sewage into the rivers when there's been extraordinary rainfall. But this pumping is happening basically all the time, and it's leading to all sorts of issues. I think in Kent there were some tomatoes that have been growing on the coast that probably might have been planted by seeds in sewage that was pumped out into the sea, and it's causing all sorts of issues for swimmers, obviously wild swimmers, and that's become really popular over the past couple of years. But also, for wildlife, and there are, all sorts of implications as well for antimicrobial resistance as well.
Okay, so this guy from Ofwat who suggested hitting the chief executives of water companies where it hurts, do you think he's kind of been able to say that because he is an interim leader? He seems to be going further than most people in that position have gone before.
He might well be trying to make sure that his job is made permanent, because he's making all the sorts of noises that, are pleasing the British public, who is increasingly annoyed about this situation. But it's quite easy to say that water company chief executives should be treated in an X, Y, and Z way. But the actual leap between, saying something should be the case and in actually becoming the case is harder to make.
Yeah, I mean, Suchandrika, I suppose, on the other hand, although it's good to see someone in power coming up with a proposal that might hit executives where it hurts, lots of people looking at this would say, well, hold on, if this was an oil company or a chemical company and they were spilling poison into our rivers, we wouldn't be sort of speculating that we should affect their bonuses. We'd be punishing them by putting them in prison.
I guess, yeah, it's just a different form of industry, really. I guess water is essential. We have it in our homes. We're used to paying water rates which are not as volatile as the prices for oil. So the thought of water rates going up along with all the rest of the cost of living increases we're going to see in the next 6 weeks is quite scary. We don't want that to happen.
No, but I'm talking about the punishment for the chief executives in power. Their company are dropping sewage into the rivers. A lot of people would say they should be threatened with custodial sentences, not just with "I will slap you on the wrist."
Yeah, and I don't know why that's happening, except that there is an ongoing fear that bills will rise. I can't think of another reason. I know that the sewage dumping is something that does happen. It's just gone up it's increased in how often it happens so sharply. And I guess the question is that the same kind of criminal action as when oil is spilled into the sea? So that could be one question. Also, are they very powerful? So, they've received more than 15 million in pay and bonuses last year, even though the amount of sewage being pumped out has gone up 37%. So their money is still going up, as a lot of company owners' money did during the lockdown and during the pandemic. No one's taken a pay cut. No one's sort of put their hands up and said, we shouldn't be doing this. So I think when all of them are kind of unanimous, all the heads of the water companies are unanimous and kind of saying nothing really, there's no precedent for how we deal with water companies doing this. And I guess it's difficult to take how we've dealt with oil companies and move it over. It's not quite the same thing.
Okay, so Suchandrika reckons that the water regulators are worried that putting in some sort of policy on this might affect water bills, and they're running scared from that. What do you think the reason is, Holden, that these companies have been getting away with this illegally for so long?
I think there has been a general view that it's inevitable and that it's almost part of the cost of doing business. The Environment Agency has mounted prosecutions for some of the worst examples. So Southern Water was fined £90 million for allowing more than 16 billion litres of sewage to flow into protected coastal waters over a 6 or 7 year period. That was a record fine, and the regulator specifically said they had multiplied the usual fine by a large amount because there was a feeling that the regular fines in the low millions just wasn't having any effect because it had been priced into the cost of doing business. I think the underlying problem is that we have a really old sewage system. A lot of it's still based on Victorian pipes. Populations have grown in a lot of areas, and so we just don't have the capacity to deal with our regular outflow of waste. And then you couple to that the increasing periods of heavy rain we tend to get, and so you have huge runoff of water from streets, from increasingly paved areas of gardens. We've lost a lot of the kind of natural soakaways that we have in the environment, and that creates this sort of surge of sort of harmless rainwater, but this goes into the drains, into the sewers, mixes with that and causes it all to overflow. And yeah, we just haven't really made the investment over a long period that would be needed to deal with that in a safe way.
And Suchandrika, just to be clear about what we're discussing here, I've seen stuff on social media of surfers and swimmers on the Cornish coast finding sewage floating along next to them, use sanitary products, baby wipes. It's really not very nice, even if you leave aside the health impact.
Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting. I think Leif has mentioned the wild swimmers. They're getting more sick. So some people, like ordinary people, are taking some of the work on themselves and they're testing water in the local area. And one example is at Conham River Park near Bristol. They tested the River Avon where they were. That's in partnership with Wessex Water. They found levels of E. coli and intestinal, I'm going to try and say this word, enterococci bacteria above the minimum standard set for inland bathing water quality. So that does indicate that human or animal feces were in the water. There was also a case study in one of the papers about someone who goes swimming in the River Thames, which is definitely a personal choice, but he and a friend went, and he used to kind of feel quite relaxed about doing it. And then one day he came back and both he and his friend were very sick, like really bad food poisoning. And it makes him think that he doesn't want to go and try that particular stretch of water again. But there's kind of no denying the fact that this is happening much more often. There are levels of dangerous chemicals in our public waterways. There's also, chemicals that are from medicines and so on. So yeah, it's really grim. It's really scary.
Okay, so let's talk about what Ofwat are saying the water companies can do then, Leif, because they are making huge profits, these water companies, aren't they? And Ofwat are basically saying you can spend more of that.
They absolutely are. Just for a bit of context here, the 10 largest water companies have cut capital expenditure in water systems by about a fifth since privatisation in 1989. And meanwhile, shareholders have basically extracted £72 billion in dividends from the industry. And also customer bills have risen by 31% in real terms since the 90s. So we've got, it's all kind of, it feels like it's become a bit, that this water kind of racket has become a sort of extractive industry. So I just want to say about the Environment Agency, while it has been doing enforcement action against water companies, it's essentially had its budget cut by more than 60% in real terms since 2010. And the number of water pollution samples taken by the agency has fallen by a third from 2009 to 2018. So it seems that the Environment Agency itself is less able to basically keep track of the cleanliness or lack thereof of our rivers. So this might also be related to austerity in the 2010s.
So as far as you can make out, is there an argument that it could increase our water bills, that we'd end up paying for this if Ofwat really put their foot down?
You know what? I think it could increase our water bills, and that would be completely unfair on ordinary, bill payers, especially at a time when bills are going up in so many other areas. I just hope that the water companies don't get away with increasing bills in order to finally get going with some infrastructure that they've been putting off for years.
It's interesting that sort of comes back again and again in stories about Britain, doesn't it, Holden? Which is, obviously sort of diluting this right down. But basically, because the Victorians were really pioneering and did everything first, no one bothered updating the infrastructure for 100 years. And now we're amongst the worst in the developed world when we used to lead in these fields.
Yeah, it seems that we took a great leap forward and then just sort of rested on our laurels for a very long time. And are now having to think about making another great leap forward. I suppose if you were going to put a very optimistic spin on this, you could say that maybe it's better that we're doing some of these big infrastructure projects now when we're very conscious about climate change, rather than having done them, say, 30, 40 years ago when we might have been locked into a pre-ecologically aware solution. I think we have actually seen some really big and positive changes in the energy production infrastructure. those have imposed costs in over the past sort of decade or so, but actually we should start to reap some financial rewards from that as well as environmental benefits, because now with the price of gas surging, wind power is actually a much cheaper way of generating electricity. So in years to come, we should see lower bills from that. Let's hope that there is some way we can, take that leap forward with our water infrastructure as well, and hopefully in 20 to 30 years be looking back on a slightly better picture.
Okay, hope is always a good point at which to end a story. So Suchandrika, I'm coming to you next after this. Suchandrika, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Oh, there are old friends, but not as we remember them.
When the 2021 Friends The Reunion special was announced, a group of streaming services purchased broadcasting rights together. Sohu and Okiwi, along with the other platforms like Bilibili and Tencent and Youku, started streaming Friends on Friday. Fans were quick to notice that changes have been made to the content, with LGBTQ plus content and episodes being changed or removed.
YouTube channel Queer News Tonight reporting on Wednesday. So Chandrika, what is the story here?
So the American sitcom Friends returned to Chinese streaming services this month after a several-year absence, but it's had some changes made, which has upset Chinese fans. So Friends has been a smash hit in the country since they started streaming it there a few years ago. The whole catalogue of Friends episodes was available on streaming platforms until 2018, and then they were removed. And what they've had now that they've returned is that they've taken out sort of references to LGBTQ plus conversations, characters, famously Ross, one of the central characters, his ex-wife, whom he's divorcing from sort of right at the beginning of the first season. She is a lesbian, and sort of reference to her are taken out. And so you get this weird conversation where Ross is kind of explaining his divorce to his parents, which is partly to do with her sexuality and a sort of late realisation of it, perhaps. And yet you're just seeing sort of shocked reactions and no actual conversation about Susan.
So hard enough to follow in a second language anyway, without taking out major plot issues revolving around certain characters.
Absolutely. Friends is definitely one way by which Chinese students learn English and practice it and get to see colloquial, albeit 90s English in action. And also it's been a way for people who identify as LGBTQ+ to see something of their experience reflected, although Friends is from the 90s. It does deal with these issues in a way that we might see as not sensitive these days. So there is a kind of strange pro and con to the situation where at least the Chinese public who want to watch this show are not seeing a backwards version of what the LGBTQ plus conversation is these days. But at the same time, the Chinese government censoring this show has caused a lot of upset on, there's been conversations on Weibo and other social networks, and then those conversations have been censored as well. So I think for us here in the West, it's quite scary.
Holden, why are they doing it? What is the current state of play regarding sexuality and gender in China, and how endemic is homophobia there?
It seems to have become more fraught in recent months, actually. It's there was a big push last year from the Chinese government trying to make sure that entertainment companies were reflecting what it called sort of traditional gender roles, and it seems particularly anxious about masculinity and portrayals of masculinity amongst Chinese men. It has a really odd history to it, this whole question. There seems to be a common belief in China that after the Second World War, the US essentially emasculated Japanese entertainment and encouraged Japanese companies to make films, make TV programs that portrayed a softer and, in their eyes, a weaker form of Japanese masculinity, it having previously had a relatively macho culture, if you think of sort of shoguns and those sort of martial arts tropes.
I mean, it's fascinating, but what are they worried about? Is it to do with, do they think, well, if we have, basically is the crux of it, if too many people are gay, then we won't have enough children? Or is it that they don't want effeminate soldiers in their army? What's the thing they're actually concerned about?
I think it may have a bit to do with both of those. Probably more the military side of things, and particularly since Xi Jinping became president, China has had a more muscular foreign policy, to use a term that feel sort of slightly enmeshed in that kind of machismo in the first place. But it has been wanting to project a more assertive sense of Chinese nationhood, and it seems to be quite enmeshed in that idea that they want real men, they want traditionally macho men, they want to make sure that their armies are taken seriously. There is also a population issue, as we've talked about on this podcast before, of that, the one-child policy was almost too successful, and now there is an anxiety about falling population, so perhaps that is feeding into it as well.
And Leif, I know you're interested in Xi's rhetoric around common prosperity as well. What's that?
I am. So one of the interesting things about China is the way it sort of reflects things sometimes that are happening in the West, but in much more extreme ways. And Xi Jinping has been talking lately about, has restated the commitment to what he calls common prosperity and a pledge to sort of redistribute wealth across the country. China has been racked, like many countries, with really stark inequality. And Xi Jinping, I think, correctly sees this widening inequality as a worrying sign of, a potential sign that there could be unrest on the way. And so he is leading a crackdown on, firstly, he was leading a crackdown on corruption, but now it's spreading more and more across to other parts of kind of Chinese society, and particularly influencers in China and celebrities have been really targeted by the government, including with some actresses being sort of fined enormous amounts of money for tax evasion. So I'm interested in how the Chinese state sees, probably accurately, that whoever controls culture controls the mindset of, to some extent, of the people. And Xi Jinping isn't squeamish about using his powers to essentially mold culture into a shape that will hopefully present less of a threat to the status quo.
Yes. Well, that's a point, isn't it? Like, whether or not you disagree with his target, Suchandrika, it's an argument for the BBC, isn't it? That it's a soft power and it unites the country. People across the political spectrum do accept that popular culture does change the way people think about things. That's why there were gay characters in Friends in the first place. So from his point of view, maybe this attack on popular culture isn't so ridiculous.
Not for what he wants to achieve, perhaps. And the fact that he's particularly looking at gay characters in Friends.
We have no evidence, by the way, that Xi Jinping is spending any time personally analysing gay characters in Friends. But
you are asking me to get into his head,
Sure.
which is fascinating. So just getting into his head here. It is not a crime to be gay in China, but it is very difficult to be gay in China compared to Western societies, compared to what we know. And so if you're sort of dividing communities and stopping people from understanding how they feel about themselves, and the fact that they can also form groups and find other people similar to themselves, then you're stopping them from finding alternative sources of power, aren't you? And so, for instance, looking at younger Chinese people who are much more socially liberal than their elders and than people of Xi Jinping's generation, what do they think of Friends? And, are they seeing themselves reflected in the LGBTQ plus characters? And so I was looking at an NBC piece, and some Friends fans say the show provides an outlet they can't find anywhere else. So one 24-year-old said, the show meant a lot to me when I first affirmed my sexual identity as a lesbian. The storyline of Carol and Susan worked as an encyclopedia to me when information about being LGBTQ plus was not available on China's internet. That made me realise my sexual orientation is not weird. So what we have is that China still exercises this power over its internet, and certain parts of it are not available to everyone. And so to make up for that shortfall in information, people look to Western forms of entertainment, and then they can go on social media and say, well, there is nothing wrong with me, this is a natural way to be, and there are other people like me. And that is a powerful thing.
Yeah, well, Holden, as a geriatric millennial like myself, it's quite reassuring, isn't it, to hear people come to this view about those characters and those themes in Friends, because there was this backlash a few years ago from Gen Z saying, as Suchandrika hinted at earlier, the way that Chandler talks to his transgender dad is abhorrent. The way that Ross voices his disapproval of Ben playing with a doll or talks about his ex-wife being a lesbian is played for laughs. But I remember that being on 20 years ago, and the point was there weren't any gay characters on TV, and it was obvious that it was obvious to me anyway, it was coming from a place where the writers and their coterie had gay friends or were gay, and it was a form of representation.
Yeah, there is a bit of an irony here that the Chinese censored versions would have actually probably produced less of a backlash from the younger millennial or Gen Z watchers when they went on to Netflix. And I think it is revealing of the way that those first steps into representation often end up looking a bit clumsy or cack-handed quite quickly as groups of people come into the mainstream and express themselves, perhaps, rather than being represented by people who aren't part of the group, and things that are even meant quite sincerely can end up looking rather cack-handed. And I think we've seen that very clearly and very quickly with representations of LGBTQ people. But if you look further back into the 70s and look at some of the sitcoms that attempted to deal with race in the UK, those now look horrendous, and there's no way you could cut them in any way and make them acceptable for viewing. But I think a lot of them were meant sincerely, and it was the first time that there was any kind of representation.
I mean, Leif, when it comes down to the censorship of these episodes, is the issue really with the Chinese at all, or is it with Western cooperation? Because no one's forcing Warner Media to sell their back catalogue to China. They could take a stand. They could say, no, we're not editing those scenes. It's integral to the plot and the script. And if you're going to buy them from us, you have to buy them complete. They didn't say that. They've taken the money. So is there a need for Western companies to put their foot down about this?
I think it depends on what you think private companies should and shouldn't do. Some people will think that companies are just about the pursuit of profit. Other people will say, yes, there's profit, but there's also principle. I think it does look pretty cowardly, but we've seen this in lots of other areas, not just, Hollywood or the TV industry selling stuff into China. We've also seen it obviously in the area of sport and the kind of awkwardness with which some American kind of sporting groups have dealt with their own players expressing, taking stands against injustices being committed in China.
Suchandrika, a final word?
China slightly messed up by allowing the originals on streaming first and then having them taken away and edited, because even we know that they were edited, like it's not a secret. So we know this has happened. And actually, the Chinese government needs to have watched the whole of Friends first before putting it on streaming.
Are you listening, Xi Jinping? You need to watch all episodes of. You need to watch the full 10-season arc.
Sorry, dude, and the reunion. I think that's our message, okay. Strong and clear.
Well, could we be any more topical? My thanks to Holden, Leif and Suchandrika for their stories. We will be back next week. We were on a break! Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann, always there for you. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.